Good morning. It's Mark with Octane Auto Tips. Welcome to Pro Auto Repair. It's a relatively brisk morning here in North Carolina. It's just below 40, I believe, right now, and I don't think it's going to get much warmer today. Bit of a dreary day as well. It's been raining all weekend. You know, I kind of wish that the temperature had been down about 8 or 9 degrees less and it was snow. At least then it would be pretty. Instead, it's just kind of mucky goodness out there. But anyway, just because it's cold mucky outside doesn't mean there's no work inside. Here we have a 2001 Toyota Avalon. It's got a 3-liter quad cam V6, and the client, the owner of the vehicle, brought it in last week for a diagnosis. Car was shaking, check engine light was on, clearly it was misfiring. I went ahead and scanned the check engine light. Did have a bunch of codes, even numbered misfires, so cylinders 2, 4, and 6 were misfiring, as well as a VVTI code, variable cam malfunction or something to that degree. I'm not sure of the exact code, but I've seen it a few times before with older Toyotas, especially once they get over the 200,000 mile mark. There's an actuator for the variable cams on both the bank 1 and bank 2, and they're prone to kind of go out. They're oil control valves is another name you may have heard for them, and they tend to just get kind of stopped up as time goes on. First thing I look at with that code is how old is the oil in the car, because if the car isn't routinely oil changed, the oil just won't pass through that valve frequently enough to activate that actuator, to activate the variable cams. Now, I can do a follow-up video on what variable cam means. I'm sure there are a bunch of them already on YouTube, so I might get to it one of these days on describing exactly what VVTI is. But if you're wondering about it now, I'm sure if you did a quick little search, somebody out there should be able to tell you what VVTI means. Regardless, back to the question, those parts can only come from the dealership. They're not too bad. I think it was like $80 or something to that degree. Not that hard to get to. But I did go a little bit further and also noticed that the spark plugs in the car were pretty grody, pretty old. They've seen too many miles, in my humble opinion, and recommended that spark plugs be done at some point. And the client had also talked about a burning smell she was getting inside the car. Now, I'm not sure if you can see this, but right there on that front exhaust manifold, there's a little pool of oil kind of chilling right there. And yeah, that'll definitely give you a burning smell, because basically what's happening is the valve cover gaskets are leaking oil, and they're leaking oil down onto the exhaust system, and of course the exhaust system gets really hot, it burns off the oil, produces a burning smell. So I said, you definitely, if you want to get rid of that burning smell, you definitely need to replace the valve cover gaskets to stop that oil leak. And since I'm doing the valve cover gaskets anyway, there's no real increase in labor to do the spark plugs, since they're pretty much right there. The big pain in the ass is, of course, taking off the intake manifold to get to the back set. So it shouldn't be too hard, but we'll get cracking here in the near future. I'm going to drink some more coffee, warm up a little bit, maybe close that door, because it's getting pretty chilly in here. So stay tuned. All right, time to get cracking. Here we go. First order of business is to take off this plastic cover over the engine. You got 3 little bolts here, which are 5mm Allen bolts or hex bolts, whatever you want to call them. So what I like to do is go through and break them to make sure they're kind of loose, because if they've been sitting for a while, they can be a little stiff. These obviously aren't, because I pulled this off less than a week ago to look at the spark plug. The other thing is this Toyota symbol up here. It's actually a screw. It threads on like so, and then you just pull it off. Sit this down. Ta-da! Looking over, clearly here's one bank, here's one valve cover, one set of ignition coils and spark plugs down below them, and the other one is back here behind this intake manifold. In order for that to come off, you've got a lot of electrical connections, you've got some things bolted on, you've got a throttle body, an air box, and air intake ducts, throttle cables and whatnot. So yeah, all this is going to have to come off.
One thing I like to pay attention to anytime I'm working with intake manifolds or vacuum lines in general is just as I'm taking them off, I like to inspect the vacuum line, make sure it isn't too brittle, doesn't show any cracks, because you know, something this old that's been sitting on here for this long, if it is brittle and cracking, odds are it's going to break when you go put it back into place, and then you're going to start the engine, and it's probably not going to run that well. May run well, but it may fire a check engine light code for a vacuum leak somewhere. So, good rule, always pay attention to your vacuum lines.
Now, if you ever do this job, you'll notice that this back bit of vacuum bits and electronics is held in by a couple of 10mm nuts, but you won't see any 10mm nuts on this wiring harness here. You actually need a Torx bit. This is a excuse me. It's a T6. Good tools to have, especially when you work on a lot of imported cars, Japanese cars, European cars like we do. So it's very good to have Torx bits. Although, just like anything else, when it's this small, be careful. If you tug on this too sharply or too quickly, you might strip them out, make your life hell, and nobody likes hell. Similar rules to German cars. German cars apply to these. Be careful, whatever you're doing, be careful. Free. Now I like to take this whole assembly now that you have it off and just tuck it back out of the way. Alright, so we're good on this side where the throttle body is. We're good on the center here. Access to all those bolts and whatnot. Now we look over on this side, and you know, we can see a couple things. We can see a couple things right off the bat that come off. That's a ground that needs to come off. I also like to just pop this off. A couple of different ways you can do about that. You can take off the nut that's holding it in place, or
I prefer to just pop it right off from that. So then yeah, pop off that ground, and then here's one of those arms, those bars that hold that intake manifold in place. There's a bolt back there that's kind of a big old pain in the rear to get to, but we'll get to it. Remember where your grounds are. If you tuck them aside or move them aside or move them out of the way, always remember where they are. Make sure you put them back when you are done. Now I'm sure you've seen me put a couple of bolts and or nuts in place after removing something. That's just to help lessen the amount of clutter I have. The less bolts I have up here to worry about remembering where they go, the better. Whereas with that, I know that that nut goes right there. I just need to then find the ground. So anyway, back to it. It's good to have varying sizes and degrees of ratchets, spanners, and sockets. There's a 3/8 ratchet with a 12mm short socket on it. What I like about this ratchet is it's very thin. In fact, it's just about as thin as a 1/4 inch ratchet. So I dig it. It seems to do what it needs to do, especially when you're trying to get into tough spaces. Although I may have jumped the gun. I think that's a 10mm. I presume at some point this has been done before. This has come off. I mean, the car is well over 200,000 miles, and these can't possibly be the original spark plugs, because that just wouldn't work. And I guess whoever put this back into place, and yes, it was a 10mm, just didn't put it too tight. I mean, it held it in place for however long it's been going, which is good. And I guess it was also good that it wasn't too tight, because it enabled me to get to it. That other one I'm pretty sure is a 12. And that's something I love about Toyotas. If you've got an 8mm, a 10mm, a 12, a 14, and maybe a 17mm wrench or socket, you can pretty much take apart the entire car, the entire engine. Now, not just the engine, because there are a lot of pieces inside the car that are also those same sizes. I like it when auto manufacturers are consistent in what they do. And Toyota is certainly consistent. That is a 14mm, not a 12mm. Oh, I'll tighten that one. Let's try this again. Talk to any automotive technician, they'll tell you so much of your job really isn't on what you can see, but what you can feel. It's not working from that way. Let's see if I can make it work from this way. Patience. It's key in all things, especially in all things automotive. All that for this. But now it's off. All right, cool. A couple of things we need to worry about. That PCV valve that's right here, that needs to be disconnected, because that runs right here to the intake manifold. Yep, there we go. All right, cool. So now we'll move on to these bolts that are holding the manifold in place. Back to hex bolts, 8mm this time. First time I've done that. Banged my head on the damn grill. Oh, half the bolts were hex bolts. The other two, 14 mils. Like I said, everything on this car, 10, 12, 14, some 17, some 8. That's about it. I got 2 nuts and 2 bolts that hold this beast in place. Another thing I'm going to have to be careful to remember, and this little 10mm bolt is holding in a ground. That's it. Another thing I'm going to have to do a little bit later, these are those 2 arms that I was describing earlier, that besides the bolts that hold the manifold in place to the plenum, these kind of hold it in place as well. There's one here on this side which was attached to the throttle body, and one over here that was attached to the back side of the manifold. They're also bolted down on the cylinder head, and before I put the manifold back on, I'm going to want to raise the car into the air and loosen those bolts just to allow these to move, to give them some play, because otherwise everything is not going to sit and seal properly, and that could create issues. This is about the time where I like to kind of look over things and see if I can kind of gauge the life of this vehicle, how it's been treated. Like I said, it does have well over 200,000 miles on it, and you can definitely see a good amount of oil down inside of these plenum chambers. Some of it's caked on. Almost like a mild case of tuberculosis in automotive terms, of course, though. So I'll clean that up a little bit later. But what we're after is here. And one thing I may also want to do is pull out this PCV valve, because a lot of times valve cover gaskets will fail because they're just old, and that's what old things do. Sometimes they fail because the PCV valve, which is part of the vacuum system, helps keep vacuum inside the crankcase. Sometimes these valves will get stopped up, and that's actually creating too much pressure inside the engine, which will then force oil out through the valve cover gasket, which is usually the weakest point. So I'm going to work on getting this off. If I do get it off with the camera still on, be able to show you very quickly how to test, see if it's still working. Pretty much you shake it around, and if you can hear a little rattle coming from the inside, that means it's probably still doing its job. But if it's stiff and you shake it and there's no rattle, then it's probably done and gone, and probably should get a new one. Alright, well, this isn't playing nicely at all. There we go. There's a little bit of a rattle coming inside there. I might just clean it off and go from there. There is no valve on this valve cover, no PCV valve. So, alright, I'm going to clean this off, see if I can get that to rattle a little bit more than it is. And then I'll get to working on this back valve cover gasket and spark plug, so stay tuned. Back for more. No, and the phone's ringing. Sounds like my business partner got it. But anyway, I'm going to start with these ignition coils. Then there are 2 10mm nuts that hold on the wiring harness back here. Get that off and all out of the way, and then I can start working on these 10 mils that are around the perimeter. Just a little side note, that PCV valve that was kind of sticking, I cleaned it out. Don't know if you can hear that, but it's definitely sounding a lot better now. But at the end of the day, I'd be really, really upset to go through all of this, put it all back together, and then in a few months have her leaking more oil from her valve cover gaskets because this PCV valve has stopped up again. So I figure after a couple 100,000 miles, it's about time to replace it. It's a $10 piece,
So at the end of the day, I just went ahead and ordered it, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in place. I mean, for $10, saves you the trouble of having to go back in and redo something. So about time to get cracking on that back valve cover. So yeah, here we go.
Well, you weren't running into the bug here.
He was doing a charity event.
But maybe the time's slow.
Alright, well, I've gone through and taken out the ignition coils. I've also separated the wiring harness so it's loose and malleable, as well as took off all the bolts around the perimeter that are holding the valve cover in place. Now, before I jump right to popping that bad boy off, I mean, there's a lot of, loose oil, but there are also a lot of little plastic pieces from where over the years this plastic covering around the wiring harness is just kind of disintegrated. So what I like to do before I open that up and expose the top part of the cylinder head to everything around it is put a little towel here over the intake chambers, the plenum chambers, and now I'm just going to take some compressed air and just blow that nastiness out of the way. To make sure it doesn't get into any internal components. Now, odds are, even if some of those little plastic pieces did find their way internally, they probably wouldn't do any damage, but I'd like to be safe rather than sorry. So, time to go ahead and blow that good stuff out of there. Well, I'm happy I put that towel down over the plenum chambers because I saw a few pieces pump up here. And again, probably wouldn't do any damage to the engine, but better to be safe than to be sorry. Alright, now to pop off the valve cover gasket, you want to be gentle when doing this. I mean, it should come off after a little bit of prying, but you just want to find a place to wedge to kind of get under and just kind of pull it up. I'm using the fuel rail right here. Like I said, be careful when prying. Don't get a big old pry bar and apply a lot of force to it, because that's made of aluminum and can crack very, very easily. You don't want to destroy the valve cover. And also the fuel rail. You don't want to puncture a fuel rail, because then you got to replace the fuel rail and you'll have gasoline spraying all over the place. That came up pretty easily. That was the easy part. The challenging part is wiggling it around this wiring harness, which could be a lot easier, but most automotive designers don't think about such things when they're designing cars. They only think about what they need to think about to get it off their assembly line. They don't think about maintenance and replacing failed components as time goes on and how to make that easier. And there you have it. Ugh. It's a little gunky in there. It's not horrible. I've seen it a lot worse. But you can definitely tell that it hasn't been the best maintained vehicle out there. Still not a horrible color. There's a little bit of burnt oil in places. But for the most part, it's a nice golden brown color, which is kind of what you want to look for. Still see one of the spark plug tube seals, which is really, really hard and brittle, is still on the spark plug tube. So next I'm gonna go ahead and take out those spark plugs, as well as clean off the perimeter, and then I'll work on the valve cover itself. Sometimes these gaskets, when they get hard and brittle, can be a real pain in the ass to take off. There have been some times where I've even had to break out a blowtorch to just kind of heat them up to help separate them, but this one came off relatively easily. You can tell that it's bad just by how stiff it is. I mean, I'm sure you can't tell how stiff it is by looking on TV or on your computer on YouTube. But see these little cracks that are popping in here? That's really brittle. So that gasket's not doing anything anymore. Here are the remainder of the spark plug tube seals. I have to get them out. They can be a real pain in the rear side too. And then of course I like to clean out and clean off the valve cover itself. So that'll come here in the near future. For now though, back to this bad boy. I like to do a couple rounds of cleaning. First round is just to get off all the loose stuff that's built up around the perimeter. And then I'll actually take a small razor blade and scrape off any caked on oil, as well as any silicone that remains, because I'll show you here in a little bit. There is silicone, even though there is a gasket, there is still silicone at a few points around the perimeter of the valve cover, and you need to get that old stuff off and apply new silicone to it before putting the gasket on. So let me get to that. This actually looks pretty good. The perimeter of it isn't that bad. Spot over here, it's got some silicone. And then round two with the towel is just going over everything I just scraped to make sure it's clean as a whistle. Alright, cool. Looks good to me. Time to take those spark plugs out. Alright, well I half expected these spark plugs to be covered in oil, considering I know at least one of those spark plug tube seals was leaking, but they're actually not. They're pretty clean. It's surprising. I mean, I'm still going to go in there with the towel and clean off, even though it doesn't seem like there was any oil leaking down in there, which is really good. Again though, the spark plugs do look a little old, and grody is the term I like to use. You see all that white frosty stuff on the diode as well as the electrode. I mean, that's normally an indication. These spark plugs probably aren't firing the way that they should be. So we got some fresh OE, original equipment, iridium spark plugs getting ready to go back into this bad boy. Got to take off that half moon. You're probably wondering, what the hell do I mean half moon? Now, I call it a half moon. I don't know if that's the technical term for it. I'm sure it isn't. Probably can't see,
here, and this is one of those sections of the valve cover gasket that needs to be resealed with silicone. There's a little half-moon piece right here by this rear-facing camshaft, by the exhaust cam. And normally just line it up and give it a couple little taps. I need something smaller, that's too big. And basically I just line up an extension right there and kind of tap until it comes free, which it hasn't done just yet. There we go. Just pop that bad boy off. And this is what I meant by half moon. I call it a half moon because it looks like a crescent moon. Basically that's right there in front of that camshaft. There's still some old silicone down in there that needs to be cleaned off, and then you reapply silicone here and put it in place. Other spots you need to put some silicone, anywhere two pieces of metal are touching, like right here and right here. A little bit of silicone there, a little bit of silicone there, and then of course on that arch where the exhaust camshaft meets the cam sprocket behind that timing cover, right around that little arch that needs to be resealed. So, time to get there. Alright, so we're down to cleaning the valve cover itself, as well as taking out those spark plug tube seals. Now as you can see, you may or may not see, there are little tabs on each side of the tube seals that kind of hold it in place. I just take 2 different degrees of screwdrivers and a hammer. And very gently I start with the small one and I'll tap, 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 pry. And once you got enough room for the bigger one, tap, 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 and pry back to get it open up. Now my worry is these seem really, really dry and really, really brittle. I believe that I'm going to need, yeah, I can see that. And also this one, just kind of falling apart, and that's not good. I'm going to try to get this under there, pop it, and pry it up, which may work. Hey, hey, hey! Okay, look at that. And here I thought I was going to have to break out the blowtorch. I should be careful what I say because I'm not done yet. Basically, you want to get under there, just work around the perimeter of that to be able to get that to come out. Hey, we got a ringer. So there are the old spark plug tube seals, yummy as they are. And then I like to just inspect in around here, take a little towel and clean it up. Make sure A, I didn't damage anything with a screwdriver, and B, just to make sure the entire seal has come up, which it looks pretty good. So we got the new gasket set here with seals, and just want to confirm you don't want to get these backwards. So if you do what I just did, and you take this off before paying attention, making sure you know which direction the tube seals go. Now, I already know I've done plenty of valve cover gaskets on Toyota engines, especially this 3-liter engine. Basically what you want to do is take the seal and just put it over the spark plug tube. It will go over relatively easily one way, and it won't go over the other way. So see, that is how it is supposed to sit. So it went on that way pretty easily. This way, it really doesn't want to go on. You would have to force it to get it on, and normally if you need to force something, then it's probably not supposed to be there. So that, I know, goes that way, meaning that this side faces the top. Now, knowing that this side faces the top, keep in mind that this is inverted. So top is bottom, bottom is top. So this part was facing up, so therefore here, this will face down. You see the inner seal raises up a little bit higher. That should be on the bottom.
little extension. Just kind of go around the perimeter and give it a tap, 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 tap. You want to be very gentle when you're tapping. You don't want to damage the seal. Again, I keep going back to damaging the seal, because if you damage the seal, you're going to have to redo everything you've just done. Or I should say, I'm going to have to redo everything I've just done. And I don't like doing the job twice. And once I get them in, I try to go along the inside to make sure that they are flush, totally seated. Alright, next step, take these tabs that you bent up before and just bend them down. Quick and painless. Cool. Well, next step for me is cleaning this bad boy off. Alright, well, next step for me, clean this bad boy off. I don't think this is going to become as clean as it was when it was brand new, but I'll get it a lot cleaner. If you use non-chlorinated brake cleaner or chlorinated brake cleaner without safety goggles, like I'm not using safety goggles now, keep very wary of it, which direction it's spraying. So I recommend paying attention to where you're spraying so you don't spray yourself in your face. Cool. Like I said, not as clean as it was when it was new, but a hell of a lot cleaner it is now. So just give it a wipe down and get ready to put that gasket in place. Alright, now inside of our valve cover gasket set we have two gaskets, probably because there are two valve covers. Basically you just want to try to line up which one you think to be proper. If you don't get it right the first time, it's okay. You got another one. This one seems to be the proper fit for this side. So far so good. It's following the perimeter very well. Alright, now once I've got it inside, I kind of like to knead it, massage it along those lines. Make sure it's really sitting down in that groove. And if you thought it was tricky me getting this valve cover off, it's even trickier trying to put it back on, because when you're pulling it off, it doesn't really matter if the gasket comes apart, because you're replacing it. When you're putting it back into place, you definitely need the gasket to stay seated the entire time, which is tricky. Before I get to that, I got a couple things I want to do. One, I want to put these new spark plugs into place, just to make my life a little easier. And then two, I'll show you how to reseal this little half moon, as well as those other spots along the perimeter of the cylinder head where it meets the valve cover that need to be sealed with silicone. So let me go throw these spark plugs in. Alright, well, this next little bit's going to be tricky because I really don't feel like getting any ultra black silicone on the camera. So let's see if I can do this. Basically, this is some Permatex ultra black high temperature silicone. And what you want to do is go answer the door. And what you want to do is just kind of squeeze it onto this little half moon. Make sure you pay attention to which side is which. Clearly the side that looks all oily will be from the inside of the valve cover, as opposed to the clean side will more than likely be to the outside of the valve cover. So after you silicone that, just get it in place, push it on down, give it a little squeeze, and make sure it's flush. And then I like to take the silicone that is squeezed out and kind of just go over where the metal points meet. At that point, I might as well also
take a little silicone and just go over the sections that I said need some little attention. Don't need a lot, just a little bit to make sure that oil doesn't begin to leak. And then the tricky area, especially for this back valve cover, is right in here. Alright, so looking over where I put that silicone, looks good down there. Looks good over here, and also that little half moon or crescent moon is right there. And looks pretty good. Shouldn't leak. Nice. So next step is the tricky step, and that's actually putting the valve cover in place. Yay. Here goes. Again, making sure that the gasket is firmly in place, and then finding a way to get it on without allowing that gasket to slip off. And this is the part where I like to stick my fingers into those spark plug tube seals, or spark plug tubes, to make sure the seals are sitting properly. And also, oh, that felt good. That felt really good. What I also like to do is I like to take one of these ignition coils and just slide it down into place where it sits, just to make sure that none of those spark plug tube seals are sitting improperly. Sometimes they'll get kinked on the spark plug tube itself and will protrude in here. And if you don't do this before you put everything back together, you bolt the valve cover gasket in place, and then you go to put these on and realize, oh wow, those tube seals are not sitting properly and will probably start leaking. So hopefully that's not going to happen. They all feel pretty good to me. So what I'll do is just get the flashlight and take a quick little peek underneath. Not going to bother bringing the camera in because I don't think the camera's going to be able to see. And it looks good. I'll run my finger around the back side, make sure the gasket's not sticking out. The last thing I like to do is take a mirror, clean it off first, dirty mirror. That works. And then I'll take the mirror and go behind the valve cover just to give me a glimpse of the way that that gasket is sitting. It looks good to me. Now the true test will be once it's all back together. And in the meantime, I'll start with these bolts. Alright, once I have all of them in place, I'll just wind all of them down by hand before using a ratchet. Now I recommend when tightening these,
to use a 1/4 inch drive instead of a 3/8, and definitely not a 1/2 inch drive, mainly because these bolts do not need to be that tight at all, and the bigger drive you're using, the more leverage that you're turning with, and you don't want to break these, because if you break these, it's going to make your life a living hell. So when torquing them down, I like to start from the inside and work my way out. And then once I've done that, I'll go around the perimeter and just check the torquing of each of these to make sure that they're snug and not too tight or too loose. Alright, it's cool. They're in place. Go ahead, put my ignition coils into place. Alright, get the 2 nuts for the wiring harness. Get that back into place. I'll go ahead and plug in all of the electrics that I had previously unplugged. I don't believe I took these fuel injector lines off as I was removing the valve cover, but just to make it easier, putting it back into place. Alright, cool. So that back valve cover is in place. I'm about to go down there and just loosen up that bottom bolt to make sure we can get that back into place. This one over here is already loose. I'm also going to hold off on putting on the intake manifold, mainly because the oil control valve is right there for the variable valve timing, and I might as well leave all that off in doing that. And it just arrived a few minutes ago. Great. I'm going to take my jacket off. It's still cold, but I'm sweating. Alright, now we're under the beast. It's kind of hard to see up there. I mean, you can see a lot of oil kind of downward of the valve cover. You can see how badly it was leaking. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that off. And also that 14mm bolt right there is what's holding that arm in place. So just going to take a breaker bar with an extension, a 14mm socket, and just loosen that bad boy up. So yeah. All right, a few minutes later, and you know, just right off the bat, you can see it's a lot cleaner. Gone ahead and taken care of all that oil. It's always good to clean off the oil from the old leaky valve cover gasket, because when you go to check the car after running it for a while, if there's still oil on there, you're not going to be able to know if the oil that you're seeing is new oil from the new gasket leaking. So it's nice and clean now, which is good. That bolt is loose, so I should be able to get it in place. And I'm talking very fast because the battery's dying on the camera, so, and it's still got a lot to film. So here we go. Okay, as I said, battery's dying on the camera, and I really don't feel like stopping what I'm doing and letting it charge for an hour. So I haven't been filming everything, but I went ahead, took out ignition coils, also loosened up all the bolts and removed them from the perimeter. So getting ready to pop this valve cover off. This one's much easier. No, same deal up here. Got a few spots of some burnt oil, but other than that, it's not too bad. I will, of course, recommend to this client to step up her oil changes, do a little more frequently. Here we have a little bit of silicone that's you know, still on there. It needs to be scraped off and cleaned off, and then there's another one of those half moons right here. So I'm going to get on breaking all those, well, taking all of those off, not breaking anything, hopefully, and we'll check back in a bit. Okay. state battery, didn't film that since we saw it. It was pretty much the same thing up here that was done back there. Went ahead, took care of the valve cover gasket as well as the spark plug tube seals, put in new spark plugs, put everything back into place, and now I'm at a bit of a standstill because that dealer that showed up a little bit ago brought the wrong part. So waiting for the dealer to come in to replace that oil control valve for the variable timing, and I'm going to hold off on putting all this good stuff back together until then. So probably be an hour for me, but only a few seconds for you. Alright, still at it. Tell you it hasn't shown up yet with the proper valve. So I just went and put enough stuff on to still clear up some space for said valve. So intake manifold's back on and in place. Ground wire. Ground wires have been attached. Also that ground wire on the back side with the 10 mil has been attached. The securing arm back here has been attached and tight. All four of these are attached and tight. Don't go too tight on this. This is aluminum, so if you go too tight on any of these, you're going to wind up breaking that manifold and hating your life shortly thereafter. Also went ahead and put the throttle body back into place. The arm, the securing arm for that is also on and tight, as well as the 3 bolts holding the plate on. I did go ahead and also clean off the throttle plate, as well as the where the throttle body meets the intake manifold. So that's nice and clean. Gasket still looked good, so I'm not going to go ahead and replace it. If it was a paper gasket, I would have replaced it, but it's a metal gasket, and odds are it's probably still in one piece. Other than that, electrical connections are still in for here. What I have left are throttle cables, clearly, and as well as this evap bundle, I'll go ahead and call it, this vacuum bundle of evap hoses and solenoids and vacuum switches and whatnot. That I'm going to hold off before putting back into place because of that variable timing. Actuator valve goes right here. So I'm at a standstill, which I guess is good. Gives me a chance to A, clean up my mess a little bit, and B, sit on my ass and relax for a little while. So I'll check back once that part arrives. Hopefully it'll be here soon because she probably wants her car, and the day is ticking away. It's 3 o'clock already. Goodness gracious. Okay, anyway, be back soon. Yay! Toyota has shown up. Not only did they show up, but they brought the right part this time. So time to put this beast in place. Amazing how easy it is when stuff's out of the way. Alright, it's about time to get cracking on putting the rest of this back together.
couple vacuum hoses and whatnot, electrical connections. It's all going onto the airbox. Quick once over. Make sure everything that was disconnected is attached. Alright, well the camera cut off of me as I was recording, putting it all back together. In fact, the mic cut off on me now, so let me keep this short, sweet, and to the point. Everything's good to go, everything's back together. I already gave the car a little bit of a road test. Seemed to drive just fine. A good way to test those VVTi actuators is to kind of punch it, be heavy on the throttle, because they only come in during a certain throttle position. It seems to be good, burned like a kitten. Of course, there's a lot of oil that still needs to burn off of the exhaust system. I did my best cleaning it, but it's been leaking for years. So I think she's good to go. And again, you know, make sure you take care of your small problems before they become big problems, like this oil leak. I'm not sure that the valve cover gasket leak is what caused the actuator to go bad, but something tells me with it leaking and then running low on oil, that could probably do it. But again, it's Mark with Octane Auto Tips here at Pro Auto Repair. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Have a wonderful day. Ta.